Hello and welcome to this webinar on peer support and the value of good mates. A particularly warm welcome to all of you who've joined us for the live activity today, and judging by the numbers of people who've logged on, this is clearly a topic of great interest to people. Welcome also to those of you who are watching us later on one of the recordings, and a very warm welcome to our two panellists who I will introduce you to in just a minute. First though, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands across Australia upon which our panel and our participants are located. I'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present and future. And in the context of this webinar series, I would particularly like to acknowledge the many Indigenous men and women who've served in the Australian Defence Force over the years. The research evidence is very clear, and I think that we probably all agree that having good friends and family to support you is really important for our psychological well-being and our mental health. And so the aim of tonight's webinar is to tell you a little bit more about peer support, both formal and informal, and about the value of support you can get from your mates and from your loved ones. And I hope that by the end of the webinar, we'll all go away resolved to make better use of our social support networks and perhaps to think a little bit more about how we might help other people as well. My name's Mark Creamer. I'm a clinical psychologist in private practice and also a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Melbourne. I've got a long interest in the mental health effects of trauma, and particularly in veteran and military populations. And in my clinical work, I place a very heavy emphasis on the importance of social support as a really integral part of treatment. And so it's a great honour and a privilege to be able to facilitate this panel tonight and to be able to pick the brains of our two expert panellists. So without further ado, let me introduce them. You have their detailed bios, and so I will just provide a very brief summary. First of all, let me introduce Timothy Locke. Timothy spent 10 years in the Australian Defence Force from 2004 to 2014 as a combat engineer. In 2009, while he was in Afghanistan, he was involved in an IED blast, an improvised explosive device explosion, suffered serious multiple injuries, which took several years of rehabilitation and recovery before he transitioned out of the ADF. Tim is now a peer advisor working out of the VVCS office in Townsville, and so he is ideally placed to contribute to our discussions tonight. Welcome, Tim. Thanks for joining us.
No, thanks for having us. Cheers.
I know, Tim, that you're very keen on sport, and I know you like rugby in particular, which kind of makes me feel I should say something about the record of the Wallabies against the English, but perhaps I shouldn't.
I'll get you own coach first, mate, and then we'll talk, eh? So.
Touché. Okay. More seriously, though, I also know that you're very keen on scuba diving, and I guess you live in one of the perfect places to be doing scuba diving.
Well, it's definitely a benefit of living in Townsville, far north Queensland, and it's just what we have around us, and it's actually very underutilised by a lot of the people who reside there. A lot of tourists come to the area, but not actually many people who live there will actually go and explore and have a look at it, and I encourage everyone to do so.
And do you think, do you see, we'll probably talk about this more in a minute actually, but do you see scuba diving as a way of kind of managing stress? Does it help you to kind of unwind a little bit?
I definitely think so, because there's a link between, I'm sure you know more about this than I do, in regards to breathing and keeping your stress in check and mindfulness, so being in the moment, and scuba diving sort of ticks all those boxes in my opinion, but you're the one with 300 books to your name. I'm sure one of them mentioned something like that. So.
I'm sure it does somewhere. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Tim. Our next panellist is Jane Burns. Jane is Professor of Innovation and Industry at the University of Sydney. She was the founder and CEO of Young and Well Cooperative Research Centre, which focused on the use of technology in promoting good mental health in young people. You can tell from her bio that she has a very long and impressive list of achievements. I won't go through them all tonight, but one that is very relevant for us is the fact that Jane is the chair of the National Advisory Committee of VVCS. So welcome, Janie, and thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Now, I think I'm right in saying, Jane, that you're not a veteran yourself. So how did you get interested in the whole area of veteran and military health?
So I have worked in suicide prevention for 20 years. Started really at Beyond Blue in its startup phases. And back then, VVCS came to Beyond Blue and working with Vietnam veterans asked us to write a book for sons and daughters. So I became quite interested in it. But when I was tapped on the shoulder by the then Minister Ronaldson around chairing VVCS, we'd already been doing some work with DVA around the development of the High-Res website, around this concept of co-design and co-creation, my area around digital health solutions and what that might mean, and how people could design services that actually made a difference to the people that they were there to serve. So when I was asked to join, I'm very deeply passionate about mental health and wellbeing, big focus on wellbeing, big focus on holistic healthcare. So how do we look after ourselves and keep ourselves mentally fit? And it just seemed like a great organisation with a focus on supporting veterans and their families. And so that was 3 years ago.
Yeah, great. Well, it's great to have you tonight, and we'll certainly pick up on some of those ideas about how we keep mentally fit and so on. Okay, before we get started, I need to just do a little bit of admin. So first of all, if you get any technical difficulties, the number should be on your screen, 1800 733 416. The structure for tonight is that we're going to chat for 30 minutes. Our two panellists are going to do a couple of presentations, and then we'll go into questions and answers for 30 minutes. Many of you have already sent in questions. We've had some great questions, so thanks very much for that. But you can also submit questions or comments as we go through the webinar. And I've got a little screen in front of me here, so any questions that come up, we will do our very best to answer, and do forgive us if we don't quite get round to your question. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available in about a week, and VVCS will send round the link so that you can access that and you can forward it to your friends and so on. Finally, please don't forget the feedback survey. So at the end, before you log out, we're going to ask you to complete a brief feedback survey, and we'd be very grateful if you could do that to give us some idea about how you found today's session. Now, though, I'd like to hand over to the first of our panellists, Tim, to tell us a little bit about his experience in the military and perhaps before, but also his experience of peer support. Tim, over to you.
No, thanks very much. So to everyone listening at home, the first thing we need to sort of clarify first is, today we are talking about peers and peer support, and going by some of the comments, we've had some people a little bit, not confused, but just unsure of. Myself and another bloke by the name of Andy up in Townsville, we are what we refer to as peer advisors, and we are in a Monday to Friday full-time role. Tonight we're also going to be talking about our role, but we're going to be talking about what it means to be a peer. So that doesn't matter if you are a veteran, if you are the brother, sister, mum, dad of one, if you're helping out your mate. So it's same, but one is a paid role and the other one is, so someone you're just out of hours type of thing. So we'll talk about that as we go on, but real quick. So on about myself in 7.5 minutes, you poor buggers. So first of all, my name's Tim Locke. I grew up in central Queensland on a cattle property outside of a small place called Springshaw. I had a very positive and active upbringing, so no real concerns there. I joined the Army at the age of 17 in 2004. One of the pictures there, that was taken of us in East Timor in 2006 on the tall, skinny one with the big head in the back. Obviously, at that point, I really enjoyed playing sports such as rugby union and swimming, things like that. So during that time, everything was I was very happy and content. From the ages of 20 to 21, things started to take a little bit of a slide. I started developing physical injuries, which is very common for, during the military service. So things such as shoulder pain, shin splints, arcs of my feet, basic things like that. I was then going through what some people refer to as the becoming jaded phase. So I was spending a lot of time away from home, deployments, out bush, on courses. At that stage, my family, we started having some dramas with our personal lives at home as well, so that wasn't helping. My physical fitness was beginning to deteriorate, therefore my performance at work was beginning to deteriorate. My use of alcohol and tobacco was beginning to increase, and I was starting to develop more and more injuries, and I was starting to show signs of anxiety and depression. But me being, at that age and knowing what I knew back then, I did not seek any help. I did not seek any counselling, and I paid the price for it, which we'll talk about a bit more. So from then on, from around the age of 21 to 22, my injuries, they started to get a little bit better. I started seeking a bit more of an active lifestyle outside of the fence. I started to actually, started to travel a bit more. I was starting to develop some hobbies. But essentially what I was doing then, I was just distracting myself from a lot of the problems that I had. The family problems that I spoke about before, they were beginning to intensify at this point, and I was starting to receive pressure not to deploy, which during that time, we're talking around 2009, which was my deployment to Afghanistan. I had all these things going on in my life, and once again, I did not seek counselling. I did not seek advice from professionals or even my friends, because I felt I didn't want to let anyone down. I was ashamed. Didn't feel comfortable, quite simply. So we were deployed to Afghanistan in 2009. There's a picture there with a few of the boys. Once again, there's the guy with the big ugly head in the back. That's me. So there we are in Afghanistan, 2009, and probably about a week after that photo was taken, our section vehicle, we were hit by an IED. So there's a nice little photo there for you. So from there, without getting too much into it, I split my head open. That was the butt of the Mag 58. You can see the little stitches there. I broke my right femur. My right foot was crushed. I needed 11 screws and half Meccano set to put that back together. And just some little bit of bumps and bruises, and you get a good list there. So, now from there, what was happening is the physical injury at that stage was, that took my mind off a lot of things, because, when you're got that much morphine pumped into you and that, you're pretty all right. But the drama was I was moved from Turrenkau, then next minute I was in Germany, and then a couple of weeks later I was in Brisbane. And all my friends, they were either back in Afghanistan, or they were deployed to East Timor, or they were back in Townsville, and I'm in hospital in Brisbane. I did have some relatives in Brisbane, but I didn't have my best friends there. I felt I didn't have any peer support. The other one is I didn't ask for any, and so a bit of the onus has got to come back onto me. So at this stage, those family problems I was talking about, well, they became even worse, and there was a suicide attempt within my family. So at this stage, I'm starting to abuse painkillers. I'm able to get up and move around, so straight into the bottle-o, straight back into the cigarettes again. So during that stage, I was out of hospital, and I was not supervised as closely as I was before. I felt my career was completely finished. I felt my life was finished, and I was starting to have suicidal ideations. I won't go through how I was planning to commit suicide, but to give you an idea, I'd actually gone through my life insurance policy to find loopholes. I'll leave it at that. I was angry, I was sad, I was frustrated, I was extremely aggressive, and I was at breaking point. So at that point, that's when I called the VVCS 24-hour number. So now I'm not only an employee of VVCS, I'm actually a former client, former consumer. And from there, that's when, I'm not going to say that everything was hunky-dory from there, but we started to form some strategies. And all my problems that I had, they were laid out in front of me in a way I could understand and a way I could manage. It was not the be-all, end-all, but it made my life a bit more livable, if you will. But within 3 months of that low point, things were starting to pick up, and I could notice an obvious change. But it didn't start there. So from the ages of around the age of 24 to 27, I'm 31 now, just to get a rough idea. I was then posted to the School of Military Engineering. And that was under my own request, because I asked my superiors, well, at this stage I had gotten I was out of a wheelchair, I was off my crutches, and at the worst point, just to give you an idea, I'm 6'4" and usually around the 100 kilo range. At that stage, the height I am now, and I was down to 57 kilos. So I'd lost a fair bit of weight, and I wasn't myself. So I asked my superiors if they could post me to a training establishment where I could, even if I was still in a wheelchair, I could, in the words I used at that time, sit in front of a PowerPoint presentation and gob off, which is kind of what I'm doing now, but either way. And they agreed to that. They said, right, and so the main word is I was able to achieve meaningful employment, and we may talk about that a bit later. I was able to, from there I was put under a little bit of pressure, and it was the good type of pressure. There were some people, they were very sympathetic to what I'd gone through, but there were some people going, well, that's great, but you still have a job to do, and I expect you to do it properly. And that was the right amount of pressure that I needed to continue and build myself up a bit. Now, during this stage, I was able to actually reconnect with two very good friends of mine who were in my bridal party. And we were actually able to see each other quite regularly because we weren't out bush 6 months of the year and things like that. And I was actually able to, I guess you could say, develop a good peer network around myself. So then from there, my friends, they started to convince me into, I'll start wrapping it up, it's okay. I was starting to look into different methods of how I can make my life a bit better. We'll just go on to the next slide here. And so I tried a lot of different things. I tried different exercise. I tried meditation. That didn't work. But the main point is it took a long time for me to actually find out what I wanted to do. And, you know, some worked and some failed. And the hardest bit was actually trying something, thinking, yep, this is going to be sweet. It's going to be great from now on. And then have that completely blow up in your face. And then having to do that 7 more times until you finally figure out the thing that you want to do. But essentially, it took a long time. So we're talking about 7 years after the IED strike was my life actually becoming, I was a lot less angry. I was actually more enjoyable to be around. And as a result, I'm now married. So I've actually managed to hold down a relationship, which is, you know, I think that's probably the highlight of what I've achieved so far. So from there, I transitioned out of the ADF into the employment world. That brought its own challenges because, as you can imagine, there aren't a huge lot of jobs out there for a combat engineer with a buggered up leg. So for the next 3 years, I worked in a youth detention centre in Townsville. That is where I learnt some skills in regards to individual care and dealing with difficult people, but just basic communication skills for those who are in crisis. Did that for 3 years, and then I saw the application come up for a friend of mine I was working with at Cleveland showed this to me about the peer advisor role that was being advertised. I was about this close to not actually applying for the job, to be honest with you, because the things they were looking for was someone with lived experience with the ADF and with mental health concerns, and that was a bit of a... Yeah, I don't really know how to feel about that sometimes, but either way. And here I am now. So in Melbourne, in front of a camera, in front of you poor buggers. So the way I look at my current role now is, you know, as I said, there's myself, and on one of the slides you can see there's myself. There's a social worker, Mark, in the middle, and there's Andy. He is a Rwandan veteran. Former 2-4 Royal Australian Regiment. Do you want me to talk quickly about my role now, or do you want me to wrap up and we'll come back to that later?
I think just a few words about your role now would be good because it sets the scene, yeah.
Yep, cool. All right, so essentially what we do is we get a lot of clients, they come in and they find it actually very difficult to talk to our clinical staff, because they find that half of the session they're actually explaining what a lot of the acronyms of their service means, or they feel they're actually teaching someone about, you know, what it's like to be in Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever their deployment was, rather than actually receiving counselling. But then there are some people, they do not feel comfortable talking to someone who has not had the same lived experience as they do. This is where we come in, and I understand that, yeah, there are some people that are more than happy to talk to someone like myself about their concerns, but then some people may really cringe at the idea. The whole idea is we are providing another option for our clients to come to. So just it's more choice and, yeah, just more options, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Tim. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? But still...
ups and downs.
Yeah, exactly. I'm really impressed by where you are today, I must say. I've got a load of questions that I want to ask you, but I should probably give priority to our participants, so I'm going to do that. So we've got a question from Pam, who was interested in the extent to which you felt that the ADF assisted you during your transition out of the military.
I thought the defence gave me a fair bit of support, and the best thing that it wasn't so much what the ADF did as a whole, it was what the individuals in the defence said to me. And they were very direct, and they made sure that my expectations were realistic. And they made, honestly, they said, no, I had people saying, have you done everything you possibly can? Have you planned this out? Some people use the term rage quitting. They've had a gutful of the ADF and they wish to remove themselves from it. But by doing that, they end themselves in more deep water. So the superiors that I had around me, they were very supportive, but they're also very direct in their feedback as well. And I think that's what helped me out the most.
Good. And it is a kind of a bit of different strokes for different blokes, I guess. You know, some people respond well to some things than others. Anyway, we've got to move on.
Yep.
But thank you very much for that, Tim. That was very, very valuable indeed. I'd like to hand over to Jane to talk a little bit about the research, about best practice, about what we should be doing in this area. So over to you, Jane.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So as you introduced me, I am chair of VVCS, and I wanted to just explain a little bit about how VVCS has evolved over the last 30 years. So Veterans and Veterans Families Counselling Service was set up by veterans from the Vietnam War. And it was set up as a counselling service. Now, clearly over the time period, the demands of people have really changed. And so the service is designed around veterans and their families to look at how they can best support them with this concept of no wrong door. As Tim has talked about, getting into help, getting into care, getting support early, particularly when it's around relationship breakups or when it's around something stressful that's happening in your life, and let's admit it, life is pretty stressful, you often can get that support which will help you get through that difficult time. But it's also there to provide treatment and care. And we'll talk a little bit about this in more detail about how we can provide high quality evidence-based treatment and care, but wrap that around full support, such as the support that's provided by peers, such as a formal peer worker, or the networks in which we spend time. And you can see up on the screen at the moment, there's the call line, which is 24 hours, the 1-800 number. VVCS work in communities in which people spend their time. So they understand the context of the community, they understand what's going on in that local community. It also reaches out through less traditional means. So it is engaged in social media. It uses stories told by veterans and their family members to ensure that it's seen as a service that people trust. And that's critical to actually getting people into care earlier. We know that if people trust a service, if they feel that they're getting high quality care, they feel that it's a part of and understands what's going on for them, they're far more likely to come back and use it, and they're far more likely to explain how that service has helped them to their friends. So the series of DVA mental health videos are really stories of how people have got through their own difficult times and how a service like VVCS can help. The other thing that I think is quite unique about VVCS is that it really looks to how can we work with veterans and their families to shape the service. In my world, we call that co-creation and co-design. In probably everyone else's world, it is let's create a service that people are going to use and make sure that it's done in a way that makes sense to the people who are going to use it. We were talking before we got on the webinar about the idea of counselling and how most people don't want to go and talk to someone about their problems. So the challenge for us as a service provider is to say, how do we actually ensure that we understand the context of what someone's going through and make this feel like a safe, supportive, engaging space? And the idea of Tim as a peer support worker is to bridge that gap in many ways. You talked about language, you talked about just knowing what's going on and your own lived experience. Now that is different for everyone. So the idea of peer support is what's right for you and when it's right for you and who you can reach out to, and making sure that we talk about toolbox and the resources that you have available. There are so many different ways to connect with peers, but also with the resources that might be available through services. We have talked about a much more formal approach to peer support, and I think the evidence is fundamentally clear the benefits of mateship, the benefits of what it means to connect in a meaningful way with someone that you trust, that you care about. Simple things like playing a sport, joining a community club, enjoying actually just being a part of a community. They're all really good for your mental health and for your well-being. So to me, that's not rocket science. I think we've been saying this forever. You know, human beings fundamentally want to connect, and they want to connect with people that they feel have the same experience as them or that enjoy doing the same things as they have done. So that's more of the informal, and you can see that happening on Facebook, on Twitter, if you're on it, in communities where people go and spend time. You know, you see it happening in the local pubs, in our clubs, on the golf course, at the footy. They're informal networks, and they're critical to supporting mental health and well-being. Increasingly what we're saying is, well, how do we actually bring that into a much more holistic service model? What does that look like to create this idea of connection and community and my experience and how I can share that to help someone else? And how do we do that in a way that supports those stories and that storytelling so that it's done in a safe and supportive way? And we'll talk a little bit about that in the discussion. But I've got 2 examples up there. And they're not veteran specific, but I think they'll give you an idea of what we mean by a much more, I suppose, informal but facilitated forum. So the first one which I've got up is Hello Sunday Morning. Young guy Chris Rain out of Brisbane started this up about 7 or 8, might even be 9 or 10 years ago, to start to challenge the drinking culture. Not to say don't drink, but rather to say have a break from alcohol, and let's think about how we might do that in a peer-supported, facilitated way. So in the last 7 years, they've had 100,000 members, and it's increasing. Stories told about what's worked, what hasn't, successes, failures, and I think that's the real challenge of peer networks. It's not a one-size-fits-all. So when we talk about diversity and different people and what suits them, it's absolutely finding the thing that is right for you, whether that's face-to-face or online. The response rates, so the idea around these peer-facilitated forums is that they're available 24/7, that you can actually get a response when you need it most. So it might be when you're at your critical time, middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, you're feeling anxious, you've woken up. You can't go down to a local service. You could ring the hotlines, but this is a more informal way of connecting and getting care. The second one I've got up is SANE, and they run 2 forums. One is for carers around getting help for yourself. What does it mean? How can I understand what's going on for this person? How can I support them, but how can I also look after myself? And again, it's a moderated forum with stories, with examples of things that work, examples of things that you might not actually ever speak to a counsellor about, but actually make sense for the people who are living it and experiencing it. And the other one they offer is around lived experience. Again, people sharing their own experiences, their own stories. And again, you might not connect with, a 50-year-old man if you're a 25-year-old woman. You want to be engaged with those peer support networks that make sense for you. But they're designed to be quite diverse and to bring in lots of different stories so that you can find something that actually makes sense for you, for the experience that you're having, and the particular time in your life that you might be going through something difficult. Right care, right time, right place. These are all the big buzzwords that everyone is using now, but I think it's fundamentally critical to the way in which we think about getting into care earlier. And to me, the potential of mateship, the whole idea of looking out for each other, we know from all the evidence, not just with defence and veterans, but across civilian life, the first people we talk to, the first people we start to reach out to are our mates or our partners. And if we can start to think of that as the wraparound support that you need when you're going through a difficult time, and then helping people understand, well, actually, does this person need to go and speak to a counsellor, or do they need to go and get care? Then we've got this whole approach to support and care that looks at the role of mates, the role of connections, and the role of community. I talked a little bit about no wrong door, and it's important and critical. It's hard to walk through that door. It's hard to actually go in and get that help. There's still stigma attached. There's a whole host of things that stop a person reaching out for care. And what we're increasingly saying is, how do we reach people in the networks in which they're connected? So whether that's through a social network online, or whether it's through hearing a story that someone's told at a community forum, or whether it's literally sitting around and having a chat. The idea is we want people to talk about how do I get into support and how do I get that support when I need it. Tim, I think, covered off whole of person perfectly. The role of family, the role of peers. When you don't know yourself that things are becoming problematic, but you're self-medicating with alcohol. So we need to start thinking much more seriously about not just here's a service and go and get support, because we know that that doesn't work, or here's something that we're giving you, here's the postcard and put it on your fridge, or, go and get the support. We need to think about how we actually engage in the worlds that people spend their time. And I think certainly having spoken to, in the role as chair of NAC, many, many veterans and their families, there are hundreds of resources out there. There's no doubt about it. The resources are fantastic from the Department of Defence, Department of Veterans Affairs and VVCS, from civilian organisations like Beyond Blue and Lifeline and SANE and Hello Sunday Morning. But it's knowing when to use those resources and how to self-manage, so how to keep yourself mentally fit and healthy, but then also when you do need care, if you do have depression or anxiety or you're experiencing PTSD, how to use those resources around shared management so that you're actually in a partnership with someone around looking after yourself. And that's where I think the peer support networks come into major play. You haven't kicked me yet, but I'm waiting for it because I think our clock has stopped. So yeah. I'll just finish up on the power of social networks. And this one is an example from Modern Soldier. There are many, many, many networks like this. The purpose of and the benefit of these types of networks is, and I talked about diversity, is that they've been created by people because they see a need. And Modern Soldier is a great example. There's 40,000 people who follow the page. They post just interesting, funny, sort of things that you would share normally on your Facebook page, but they also post evidence-based, evidence-informed information, so things about PTSD, different information about depression that might come from VVCS. And it's that idea of informal networks that bring in content that could be really relevant to people, and building that knowledge base, building that expertise and creating the toolbox of what is available for you to use. So I'll finish there.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Jane. And I really am very sorry to you and to Tim to have to kind of hurry you up because you've both got really important things to say. But I'm also very keen to make sure that we can get to the questions that you as participants have sent us, of which there are many. So perhaps we should kick off with one of those, although I wanted to pick up on something you said. But let's just pick up on something you both said, actually, which was the idea that peer support or support can be formal, but it can also be informal, of course. Do we think that one is better than the other? Do you think that formal peer support is somehow better than informal? Tim?
Well, one before the other. It's there was a time where I, between episodes, I guess you will, before seeking formal support, I was seeking support from a friend of mine, and he was the one who suggested that I see formal counselling, and I still owe him for that. But the point is, it's usually most people will receive informal counselling or informal support before they will even contemplate formal support. Most common is wife has concerns for her husband. She notices the behaviours that he is a bit oblivious to, and she suggests that he go get, or the partner go get support. So I think that's see where I'm going with this.
But both are valuable, and it's again a question of what works for them. I guess being able to relate to them.
And I'd also just add around. The evidence for informal support is very high.
Is it?
Around making sure that you're connected, you've got friends, you've got community support, you're engaged, you're having chats, all of those things. That's basic good mental health. I think what services are now seeing is it can't just be service in isolation from the peer networks that you've got around you or the community that you've got around you. And so having a formal peer worker who can actually make those connections and join the dots is critical. I think the service is going to be much better if it makes sense of, well, what's going on in this person's life? Are they going through a relationship breakdown?
Yeah. So to take that on to another stage, you can always get the feeling that these are for male army people. Is there a sense in which we need to make sure our peer support networks are diverse and perhaps gender? We're bringing women in and different services.
Oh, without a doubt. And I think there are literally, 547 studies of the benefits of peer support networks, ranging from networks for people who've experienced violence or abuse, young mums or mums who are breastfeeding who feel isolated, people who are experiencing depression. I mean, it doesn't need to be around mental health. People going through relationship breakups. These networks evolve because people feel the need and it benefits them to talk about what is going on for them. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. You can't, and Tim might work for someone as a peer support worker but may not work for someone else. And so the more peer support we can get, both informal, formal and trained, and understanding what it means to be a formal support worker or facilitated worker is critical. And the joy of this is it can be customised to meet the needs of the individual.
Well, can I pick up on that? Because we've got a great question here from David, has sent in a question. And to summarise, the point he's making is that the Defence Force is very hierarchical. Rank is very, very important indeed. And if we're talking about diverse sort of peer support networks, is it important, do you think, to have different ranks, as it were, represented? Is a colonel going to be happy talking to a lieutenant or vice versa?
I don't think it's so much the rank or, because at the end of the day, once you discharge, it's just the symbol that you wore on your shirt. But someone having the same lived experience as the other person, that is what's important. So, for example, you'll find officers may have a few more, concerns or may have received a bit more stress in regards to, career postings and that, than, say, someone who was a lower rank. But it's not so much do you need someone, the same rank, but you definitely need someone with a similar experience to you.
Someone who can relate to what you've been through, as it were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we were talking a little bit about, it's got to be someone that you also relate to, that you actually like and that you respect, I think, is probably the big word. But just putting everyone together and saying, here's a peer support network and you're all going to like each other and get along, and just because you've all done something that is similar doesn't necessarily mean that that is going to work.
No.
We're all different.
Absolutely. So I take your point. It's about finding someone that you can relate to, and these other things perhaps are secondary, really, if you can get on with them. And I'm just thinking that it's, to a certain extent, the same applies, doesn't it, when people get into more formal treatment, that it's important to find a therapist that you trust and you can relate to and so on, and not feel that... Anyway, I'd like to go on and just, if we can do fairly quickly, but it's a very important question from Andrea, who's asking about what skills or experience or minimum requirements are necessary to become a peer advisor. Tim, do you have selection criteria? Do you have to pass exams or anything to get in and to become a peer advisor?
So the best information I can give you to answer that question is on the APS Jobs website. They're currently applying at the moment, I think very soon I think they've just closed applications for New South Wales ACT, but keep watching the APS website and you'll get the verbatim, this is what they're looking for. But the main three things that stuck out with the job that I applied for was lived experience in the ADF with mental health concerns. Also, lived experience with mental health, sorry to rephrase. The other one was it wasn't necessary, but they preferred candidates who had a certificate in mental health, or those with a background in individual care, which I received mine from working 3 years in a youth detention centre. I do not have a certificate for mental health, just making it out there, but I do have the other three ticks in the box. It ticks in the box,
Yeah, and we're going to talk in a minute, I think, or towards the end, about the fact that VVCS is offering assist training, suicide training and mental health first aid and so on. So I guess also they would be very good backgrounds for someone going into peer supporting.
Absolutely.
But you did make an interesting point that I might pick up with Jane as well, that one of the criteria is that you've had lived experience of a mental health problem. And I wonder whether we think this is something that is important for a peer supporter. I mean, how important, I guess, depending on who you ask, you'll get a different answer, but how important is it that the person has had a mental health problem themselves?
It depends on what the job is. And it depends on how the role is defined. So if it is defined around a lived experience of a mental illness, then that's obviously important because you're trying to support people who are going through a mental illness, and the service is there and designed to provide treatment and care. So in that case, it's really important. But when you think about life, we all live and experience life, and we all have these ups and downs. So coming back to the question that was asked, there are ways in which people can train that upskill themselves so that they can support people who are going through a lived experience and know when to be the peer support worker or the peer facilitator or the peer networker, but also then know how to take the steps if someone's at risk or if they need to get further support. So I think it depends on the job. I think it's a really fascinating time at the moment because it's relatively new for services to have peer support workers. Into the future, I think it'll just be part and parcel of a good service.
I think, but it also raises an interesting point. I was going to pick up with you, Tim, actually, about presumably people shouldn't feel that they're only allowed to access a peer support network if they've got a mental health problem. And what if I've got a problem with transition, I've got a problem with my pension, or I've got a problem with something else? Can I still go to a peer advisor?
Absolutely. The most clients that we get coming into the VVCS office in Townsville, they will have dramas with either transition or at work or with relationships at home, and then that can, if not addressed, that can lead into a mental health concern. So if you come to the office and if you want to talk to one of us about one of those things, trying to close the gate before the ball runs out, to use in a terminology, if you will. Yeah, prevention's better than cure. There you go. That might sound a bit better. But yeah, yes, you can.
Yeah, okay. A couple of very quick, I'll just look for a very quick response if I can. Is it a voluntary or a paid role?
My job is a paid role, but we do have a voluntary peer network that we have meetings once a month for, and then we try to upskill the peers in the area so they can better support obviously the people they are in contact with.
Okay. And presumably it's stating the obvious to say that the vast majority of support, social support that people have is unpaid. Actually, it's kind of, this is what we do because we're good mates sort of thing. Yeah. Look, I just need to quickly get through these. Brett in Albury asks about how he becomes a peer advisor for the Albury-Wodonga region. And I think we just heard, didn't we, that it is being rolled out through New South Wales?
Through New South Wales, that's right. And assist training and mental health first aid. And then the trial has started in Townsville and the plan is to roll out across New South Wales.
Okay, good.
And the main message is keep an eye on the website. And that'll constantly be updated as to what's available and when it's available and how it's available.
So Margaret from Sydney also asks, where are the peer advisors located? And I suppose the answer to that is that at the moment Townsville, because that's pretty established, is now rolling out in New South Wales. And the plan, am I right in saying, is to roll it out more widely across Australia?
Well, the plan was to trial it in Townsville to see if it worked. And, obviously you want to make sure that you don't cause more harm than good. Now, the evidence is pretty strong. Peer support works. Peer support workers are important. For VVCS being the service that it is, the trial was important to do to see, did this actually make a difference? And the evidence is pretty strong. Yes, it did. So the idea now is to, in a stepped way, New South Wales being first, to start to roll out across the regions.
Okay, I know that both of you are extremely keen on physical fitness and exercise as a stress management technique, so I'm reluctant to even open this box because I think I'll never be able to shut you up. But I have to ask, because Joy asks, and I think it's a very good point, and she's asking about where people have got a serious physical injury and they can no longer indulge in sports like they used to, and how difficult it is for them to find hobbies and interests that don't have some kind of physical, when that's been so much a part of their life. I mean, clearly that was something you had to adjust to initially.
The short version is trial and error. I had to trial about, God knows how many before I finally found a sport that I can do with my injuries that I also actually enjoyed, because there were plenty of sports that, I could do with my injuries that I just blatantly hated. So trial and error, I must say, but it's... there's really not much else I can really add to that, sorry. So, yeah.
But I guess I'm also interested in how, because I know you would rate physical exercise as being very important, whether peers have a role or mates have a role in perhaps helping people to get back into exercise or start exercising.
Yeah, look, and I think there are probably two bits to this. I think for the lady who asked the question, I imagine it must have been incredibly frustrating. And incredibly hard, and feeling that you tried something, didn't work. The informal peer networks here, I think, are critical because it helps people sort of try something else or have a conversation about what else might work. And it might not be physical activity; it might be something that's more related to the community or more related to volunteer, or something that actually makes sense and creates another avenue of interest. So that would be the first thing. I think the second thing is really around what works for the individual. And again, I think it comes back to that trial and error and having those conversations. And certainly when we've spoken not just to veterans and to family members, but to people with a lived experience in the community, they'll often say, the treatment, yes, it was important, but the single most important thing I did was join a club. You know, I became a soccer coach, or I started to investigate a different hobby that actually allowed me to connect. And I think again, the joy of the social networks now is you can have people in Perth talking to people in Townsville, sharing their stories of what has worked and what hasn't worked, and did you think about this, or what does that mean?
So part of the role of the peer support, or the good mate, really, I suppose, is to help the person hang in there, even though the first time it doesn't work. Hang in there, mate. We could try something else. Let's do something different. I was also thinking, actually, in terms of people coming to you with a whole range of questions. Presumably, your role as a peer advisor is not necessarily to have all the answers, but rather as someone who can help them negotiate the system, help them know where to go to get advice, that kind of stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Because the one thing is, a lot of dramas that we face, it actually requires reading with for like transition or even moving house. There's a lot of reading of documents and signing things and blah blah blah. You've got depression and anxiety. Reading a 3-page document is extremely hard, and a lot of times you just can't do it. So you need a bit of support doing that. But even just things like, for example, there's a group back up in Townsville called Mates for Mates, and they do a very, very good job. A lot of people don't want to walk in there by themselves, because who would want to walk into a place by themselves where they don't know anyone? You're going to feel a lot more comfortable if you know someone and you go with them together like you would with a friend. So that's another part of what we do. We just assist with little basic things like that, and that's what peers can do at home as well. It's just that little basic stuff that actually speaks huge volumes.
We've got a question actually from Cheryl, who asks about how peer supporters can assist veterans who are frightened of social situations, perhaps because of their PTSD or something else, that they're frightened and they have great difficulty meeting new people and going into social situations. But again, it sounds like this is something that peers or friends, supporters can help a lot with.
And I think, we talk about soft entry, and, it is hard walking through that front door. So perhaps having that initial conversation through a forum that is a forum for people experiencing PTSD, explaining what it means, and then maybe connecting with someone in the local community. Well, how do we take the first steps? It's sort of almost the treatment's important, but it's also what are the practical examples of how I can take that baby step to get to the next phase, And that's where that sort of peer network, starting online, potentially, and then making the connections into the community. And again, it's that no wrong door. So how do we ensure that people have the tools, the resources that help them get through some of the challenges of actually making the connections? Often, and again, people might stay online for an extended period of time before they actually make that step. But the importance is staying connected and staying involved in something that makes sense to you and that gives you meaning and purpose. We've got examples of people who have said, at 2:00 in the morning, the only network I've got is my online network. It's a network of friends. It's a network I've created. They're there to help me get through that difficult time. And it's not saying that the online is better than the offline, or that face-to-face is better than online. It's what are all of these resources that we can pull on to use.
Yeah. I'd like to shift the discussion onto something slightly different for a minute. I guess this is potentially quite difficult work, isn't it? And I can imagine that a lot of people, whether they're formal peer advisors or they're just the kind of bloke that everybody goes to with their problems, can take on quite a load. And I'm wondering how important it is that peer supporters make the effort to look after themselves and continue to look after their own mental health. So would you have any comments on that, Tim?
Yeah, easiest way to explain it is the very common trap a lot of people fall into, and I've done this myself and I've seen friends do it, is they want to help a friend of theirs who has had a skinful, and they've had a few drinks, and then they end up staying up with them until, say, 4, 5, 6 in the morning, letting them vent and talk. Which seems great, but here's the thing is, if someone else comes to you at about 10:30 a.m. the next morning, you are going to be that fatigued and that tired. You're not going to be able to help that person. Then if you receive a bit of bad news yourself, then you've just put yourself into a bad spot. So the first thing is you've got to have some boundaries, like what is me helping you out and what is me, okay, this is starting to, impede on my own mental performance, my own mental health.
And that's pretty difficult sometimes, I guess, to actually say no, to reject someone, and you feel perhaps that you have to say yes to everyone. Do you want to add anything to the idea of looking after yourself?
Look, I think, again, there are some great resources that help you set the boundaries, understand how you look after yourself, when to stop being the friend and the mentor and to hand across and say, it's time to get some care. So that's the benefit of having peer support worker with clinical care and that sort of social work. And again, the resources help people understand you're not the psychologist, you're the mate, you're the friend, you might be the mentor or the support worker, but knowing when to make a decision about how to get a person into care if they need it. And there are two things we talk about quite a lot, which is looking after yourself and not taking on too much of a burden because, that's not good for your own mental health, but also knowing how to keep someone safe. And keeping someone safe is, it looks like you're not travelling well. Sitting up drinking all night probably isn't the best solution to what's going on. You might be venting and that's great, but let's think about how we actually might do something different that's actually going to be far more productive and really use the network in the way that it should be used.
Is that, do you think, Tim, taking that point a bit further, is that a good idea then that you're located within VVCS so that you've got easy access to people with some mental health backgrounds who can advise you rather than being located independently somewhere?
I definitely think so, because I think what a lot of people, including myself, don't quite understand yet is just how complex treatment for a mental health concern actually is. Like you see, we were talking before about the person with they have anxiety in regards to large crowds and that. Some people would be tempted to, let's try some do it at home exposure therapy, and let's try to expose them little bits at a time, and then eventually we'll do it. That's extremely bloody dangerous, you know what I mean? And so by people like myself working with professionals, we can actually understand a bit better, not how to do it, but just how complicated it is and just how imperative it is. It's like, this is a form of treatment. This needs to be done by someone who knows what they're doing. This is not something we need to muck around with. So,
Leading on from that then, the point you make about that treating serious mental health problems is not that easy. Do you think it's important that there is a relationship sometimes between the peer supporters and the treating professional, with the veteran's permission, of course, but that they can liaise a little bit? The peer supporter can let the psychiatrist or psychologist know if someone's getting a bit wobbly, and that kind of communication?
Oh, look, and Tim, you'll talk about this, but in my view, I think it's critical that professionals, whether it's a social worker, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, mental health nurse, that they work with the support people who support that person, whether it's a peer, whether it's a family. Now, that has to be done with the permission of the person, and setting a transparent way of doing that around boundaries of confidentiality, when we're going to actually engage, what it means, how we're going to have those conversations, that has to be spelled out up front. But that's probably the highest quality care you could possibly provide. Siloed isolation, come in, see me once a week, and not knowing what the context of that person is makes no sense to me whatsoever. But I think from a peer support worker, you might talk about your own, what it means.
I agree with everything you're saying, but they gave it the wrong tone. But for example, I was talking to a young bloke the other day, current serving member, and he was having some dramas with his discharge process or his transition. Did not know where to start, and as great as the counsellors we do have in Townsville are, and they're very good at their job, they're not current serving or ex-serving, so they wouldn't know where to start. So from my role, I can say, I've been in I've played this game before, so you need to do step 1, 2, 3. And so now we're going from tell me about how you feel to, let's actually do something. Let's get some action. Let's get the ball moving here. And a lot of ex-ADF people, they do feel that with counselling, it's a lot of lip service. There's no moving and action. And that's not everyone's opinion, but that is how some people feel. And that's where a lot of frustration can come from. Because,
so they're like...
You see where I'm going.
They're like doing something, don't they? Yeah, no, I take the point. I've got to wind it up very shortly. I'm just going to ask one more question, which comes from David in Perth, who says that there are all sorts of buzzwords around, but what do they really mean? I'm going to just take it a little further. So, we talk about mental fitness, we talk about psychological well-being. If you had to choose just 2 or 3 core things that are vital to good mental health and well-being, what would they be off the top of your head?
Sleep,
yeah.
Exercise.
Yeah, exercise.
Diet, and I'm going to do another one, stress management.
Okay, whatever that might mean. I like your first 3. So sleep, exercise and diet, I reckon, go a long way towards good mental health. I agree. Do you want to add anything to that? Would you agree with those?
I'd agree with those. I'd chuck in one more. It's my new word for the week I learned, is psychoeducation, which is in regards to people are learning about their own mental health concerns for the basis of they can understand them better and therefore lead to empowerment.
Good. I think it's a very good
like
point.
I rehearse that.
Yeah. Psychoeducation, I like.
Talking about buzzwords.
Increased mental health literacy, whatever we want to call it, but I agree entirely with you. Okay. Unfortunately, the time in these webinars just seems to race past unbelievably quickly, so the time has just about run out for us. And we need to wrap up. Before we do, I would like to ask our 2 panel members if they have any brief take-home messages for people to wind up with. So let's start with you, Tim. Any key points, any take-home messages you'd like to leave people with?
The first thing I'll say is for those who are listening in the audience who may have a mental health concern or they are in contact with someone who has a mental health concern. Good friend of mine, he told me once, do what you've always done and you'll get what you've always got. So I had a mental health concern. I was drinking a lot of rum and I was smoking a lot of cigarettes and nothing was changing. And the moment I did something different, that's when things got better for me. So maybe that'll work for you. If not, there's a 24-hour number you can call. They'll be on your screen very soon.
Indeed. Good advice. Thank you very much, Tim. Jane, some take-home messages.
So my take-homes are the toolbox. So, and again, this ties into be aware of what resources you have got available to you to help self-manage, which is about the mental fitness. How do I look after myself? How do I ensure that I stay mentally fit, healthy, happy and well? Diet, exercise, sleep, good stress management. High Res is a great resource that provides stress management tools. But if you start to become wobbly, and this is the real challenge, we want people to get into care earlier. We want them to come in and speak to someone if they are experiencing problems with sleep, if their relationship is breaking down and they are drinking more. So the real challenge for services is not quality treatment, it's rather how do we ensure that people get into care earlier, because if they get into care earlier, there's a far better outcome and it takes less time to get people back into the roles, the jobs, enjoying their family life, all of those things that we know are great for your mental health. So they're my probably 2. Prevention's better than cure, but if you need treatment, get it earlier because it's going to make such a difference in terms of the longer term outcomes.
Yeah, good, very good advice. And so even though it is frightening sometimes, it's a bit scary to acknowledge you might have some problems, to get some help, it's definitely well worth it. Okay. On your screen at the moment, I hope, it doesn't look quite right from my screen, but I hope it looks all right from where you are, you can see a number of useful resources. And regardless of what it looks like on your screen, they will definitely, these and many more will be up on the VVCS website and the Facebook and all those kinds of things. So do check them out after the webinar over the next few days. I would particularly like to give a mention to the At Ease website because I think it's a fantastic website for both veterans, their families and for clinicians, practitioners. And I also note the Hello Sunday Morning network that Jane referred to earlier. As we said, there will also be going up over the next week or so, I'm not quite sure when, some details of where and when VVCS is running assist suicide training courses and also mental health first aid. And as we said earlier, they're both really useful things. Certainly if you want to become a formal peer advisor, but even if you don't, they're just great skills to have to help your mates and help people through. And in terms of the rollout of the peer advisor network, as Jane said, keep an eye on the website and on the Facebook, VVCS Facebook and so on for more information that will keep you up to date as things are rolling out and where you can go. And of course, as Tim has said, and I think probably Jane too, never forget that VVCS is always there. It's always there for veterans, serving personnel and their families, so don't hesitate to give them a ring 24 hours a day if you feel you'd like a chat. Okay, finally I would like to remind you, if I could, to complete the online feedback evaluation before you log out. It really is important in helping us to better meet your needs and to get a better idea of how you're doing. We'll send you a link very soon to the video of tonight's webinar, which you can have a look at again if you want, or you can certainly forward it to your colleagues. So finally, thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all of you for participating in the webinar. I've been extremely impressed by the level of engagement, the quality of questions that we've had both before and during the webinar. So thank you very much for your participation. Thank you to VVCS for putting the webinar on. And of course, a very sincere thank you to our two panelists, Tim and Jane. And at that point, I think we'll leave it and just remind you that we have a lunar eclipse tonight at 11 o'clock in the eastern states, slightly earlier in the western states. So have a look at that if you get the chance. Otherwise, thanks again for participating. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye now.